I was looking at the announcement bulletin, and I don't know how many of you look at the thought for the week. And the thought for the week reads, "Our words reflect our wishes, but our actions reflect our priorities." Our words reflect our wishes, but our actions reflect our priorities. And this made me think immediately of Matthew 12 and Luke 6, where Jesus says in Luke 6, verse 45, "The good person out of the good treasury of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasury produces evil, for his mouth speaks from what fills his heart." So what is in our heart, in our mind, what we are dwelling on, will sooner or later, and maybe sooner rather than later, will come out of our mouth. But then, of course, in this thought for the week, Carolyn Hacks goes on to say, our actions reflect our priorities. And so I was thinking, so it's not just the words. So our words reflect our wishes. And it made me think of the times when sometimes you see an old friend, see someone you haven't seen in a long time, and you know, you're happy to see them, and you talk, and then either you or the friend says, "Hey, you know, we really have to get together. We really have to get together, have lunch together." And you say, "Yeah, sure." And then nothing happens. That, you know, lunch together. I imagine many of you have had that kind of experience. I have, and some of you might say to me, "Well, you could have done something. You could have called." And the answer is, of course, I could have. But then at this feast, I ran into some people that I'd known over the years, and I was reflecting on the fact that this was my 50th feast. Of course, that is nothing to people like Ron Avey, you know, or Kemmer Fund. You know, you guys been here for a lot longer than that. But, you know, 50, you know, you will know some people, and you run into some people just about any place you go. And this couple, very nice couple, they've visited here at different times. And so they said, "Oh, let's get together during the feast. Yeah, we got to get together. You know, let's have a cookout. Let's get together." And they had some health issues that they had to contend with after that first meeting, the first day. And so I'm thinking, well, you know, with health situations and not always being able to attend because of that. But sure enough, they had said, "Let's get together," and they made sure it happened. So they said, "Well, we're going to get together," and we did. Had a great time. And so their words reflected their wishes, but their actions also reflected their priorities. They actually acted on their words. So I really appreciated that and enjoyed that. And so I guess continuing there in Luke 6, when he says the mouth speaks from what's in the heart, he goes on to say, Jesus goes on to say in verse 46, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I tell you?" So I guess sometimes we can say the things, the right things, but then don't necessarily want to follow up on doing what is required to make that a reality. So I think there are those two aspects that perhaps we don't always focus on. So I appreciated seeing that in the bulletin. And I really want to talk about words today. And if I do go over a little bit, you'll have to bear with me, because the feast night I attended had long sermons, so I kind of got used to that. Again, they also had, what was interesting to me, really slow hymn leading. I thought, wow, that is, you know, compared to that, you know, people like Dixon Cartwright are fast. You know, I'm not going to say anything about my own song leading there. But you notice the contrast. Anyway, I'd like to start in Philippians 4:8. Philippians 4:8, which is a memory scripture to perhaps many of you here, maybe most. And in Philippians, of course, the prison epistle, Paul is in prison, and yet it is full of positivity, full of exhortations to rejoice. And in Philippians 4:8, Paul writes, "Whatever is true, whatever is worthy of respect, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if something is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things." And so here's a long list that he gives his readers, and by extension us, to think about. And if we're thinking about these things, if our minds are dwelling on these things, then surely we will talk about these things too, so that our words will be true and worthy of respect and just and pure and lovely and commendable and so on. And the question I guess I have for all of us, for me and for all of us, is that true as much as it should be or could be for all of us? You know, if we go back to Genesis 3, we read about Adam and Eve making a choice to take of the tree of good and evil. And ever since, humanity has followed in their footsteps. And so we decide, I guess every generation decides, every individual decides. I mean, you grow up in a family, and sure, when you're little, you do what your parents tell you to do. But at some point, usually as you get to your teenage years, you start to decide for yourself whether you agree with your parents or you don't agree with your parents, what is good and what is evil. And so there is, what I see is a whole spectrum for all of humanities from, if you were to draw a line, if I had a board here, I would draw a line. And at one end, I'd write good. And at the other end, I would write evil. And we all fit somewhere along that line. Even without being believers, all human beings fit somewhere along the line. So you would have some human beings who just by nature and maybe the wonderful upbringing that they had, whatever, they are close to this good. They may be very good people, just naturally good, decent people. And then you have the other extreme where perhaps, again, rotten, disturbed childhood, you know, a life that was a whole mess for any number of reasons, you have some people who are very evil. And most of us probably, if you took a normal distribution curve, which is sometimes called a bell curve, you know, most of us probably fit somewhere in between, either the very good, the very evil. And you know, we're in the, and you know, if you think about it, I was just reflecting on this earlier, and I thought, well, I guess it's getting close to 30 years now. Time does fly, doesn't it? I was talking to my sister earlier today, and she is much older than I am. She's probably about Ron Avey's age, and I was telling her, you know, that it will be my birthday in a few months, and she said, but Reg, you know, I don't feel, she's talking about herself, I don't feel any older than 20. You know, mentally, I don't think of myself as being this really, really old lady. You know, I think of myself as being 20. You know, where did the time go? You know, and I said, you know, I can see that, you know, in a much reduced way, you know, but I can still see that. You know, where did the time go? So anyway, maybe close to 30 years ago, the church that many of us belonged to, attended, went through some significant transformations, doctrinal changes. And all of a sudden, there were people that I considered friends who were on the good side of that spectrum, who suddenly became not such good friends, who maybe were checking on, hey, what are you doing? Where are you going? What do you believe? What, you know, so I think sometimes on that spectrum we can be influenced in one direction or another. You know, our environment can push us one way or the other, maybe even without our realizing it. You know, Mr. Avey is a historian. You know, I taught history too. You know, you look at the people of Germany in the 30s and the 40s. You know, they were no different, shall we say, than any other people, any other nationality, but they were influenced in the direction of evil by a leader and a group of people who pushed in that direction. So a lot of people are sort of in the middle, and they can be swayed. And we see that in the world all the time. We see that all the time. Even though, as I said, you know, we can naturally be good, because Paul said in Romans 1 that people are without excuse. The very creation can tell us. I mean, we heard Exodus 20 earlier. I mean, some of these things are obvious. I don't know of any culture that does not sanction or punish murder, for instance, or adultery, or some of these things. So even without Christianity, most cultures know these things. So we are on that spectrum. All of people are on that spectrum. I was also thinking about what Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn was a Soviet dissident. He died about, I guess, 12, 14 years ago now. But he opposed the Soviet regime, and he advocated for freedom. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I think it was for this book, for the Gulag Archipelago. And in the book, he wrote something that you've probably seen quoted. I certainly have seen quoted many, many times. And he wrote that the line separating good and evil, so he said, yeah, there's a distinction, clearly. There's a line separating good and evil. And if I were to ask all of you, let's have a show of hands. How many of you in here would say, hey, I'm one of the good guys? Hands up. Well, I would expect, I would hope most of our hands go. So Dixon's, shoot right up, And then I would say, okay, how many of you are the bad guys? Yeah, none of us are going to raise our hand, Even if our hand is wanting to go up, we'd sort of push it down with the other hand. No, you don't tell everybody you're one of the bad guys. So we tend to think we wear the white hats. Others are the ones who wear, the black hats. But he said, the line separating good and evil passes not through states. Now, he's not talking about states as in the United States. He's talking about countries. Because isn't it true that we can sometimes look at countries in the world and think, oh, this country, good country. This country, bad country. Good country, bad country. Now, that is not to say that there aren't countries that allow people to have freedoms, such as this country, where we have the freedom to speak, to express our opinions, to assemble together. We have so many freedoms. That is good. So definitely, if we have a continuum, a spectrum, I would argue the same as with people. We have countries that are closer to that good side, and then we have countries that oppress their people, that are oppressive and corrupt, and where people live in fear of a knock on the door at midnight, maybe being taken prisoner and being tortured or killed or disappeared. So, yes. But Solzhenitsyn is saying that's not it. That's not it. We can't just easily, conveniently separate countries. He says the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, meaning groups of people in a society. So it's not like, okay, the working people, they're the good guys. The people who are the capitalists, they're the bad guys. No, he says, no, that's not it. We don't distinguish between classes in terms of good and evil. Nor, and listen to this, what Solzhenitsyn said, nor between political parties either. The temptation could be to think, okay, political party X, good, political party Y, evil. Parties good and evil. He says, no, that's not the dividing line. He says the line separating good and evil passes right through every human heart. Line separating good and evil passes right through every human heart. Every single one of us. We're on that spectrum. Now, maybe when we were called, we were somewhere else, and maybe we were that very good. Some of you were there, and all you have to then recognize as a source of the goodness that you are able to express is God, as James tells us. And maybe you were closer to the other side, the other end, and with God's power and help, you've been moving along that line closer to the other side. But every single one of us has a mix of both. Now, there is a tradition, and this is something I encountered at the feast. Now, as I said, I had a wonderful feast. But we have a tradition, I think, in many Church of God messages, not just at the feast, but maybe year-round. Sometimes even in articles, in magazines. Different churches produce, different magazines have produced in the past, continue to produce today. And the message very often is to talk about how wonderful the millennium is or will be, which is true. I adhere to that message. I completely support that, endorse that message. Yes, it will be wonderful. But then, we've got to throw in there how terrible the world is. We talk about how wonderful the millennium is going to be, but how terrible this world is. Or, in an article, we'll describe some problem in today's world, and we'll say, well, that'll be fixed in the millennium. That'll be solved in the millennium. As I told you, I've been keeping the feast for 50 years. If we've had problems that will be solved only in the millennium, those problems have continued then for at least 50 years, in my experience. For 50 years. But my question, or one of the questions I have for us, is everything today bad? Is everything today bad? Would Jesus, if he were preaching today on earth, would he have spent his time, say, criticizing today's politicians and policymakers? Would that be the thrust of his message today? Spending time from the pulpit just slamming politicians and policymakers. Okay, another question. Should we ever do anything at all to help solve today's problems today? Without waiting for the millennium, the world tomorrow. Should we do something about fixing them now? Now, let me give you a couple of examples that made me think about this. And one of them has to do with criticisms of public education. Now, Mr. Avey worked in public education. I worked in public education for a number of years. And particularly when I first started, I can't tell you how many times I would encounter someone who would say to me, yes, the public schools, going to hell in a handbasket. It's all terrible. I wouldn't put my kid in public school. If you're real converted, you wouldn't either. By the way, both my kids went through public schools. I would homeschool them, or I would send them to a private school, or whatever. Public schools are bad. And they're getting worse. And it's because God was taken out of the classroom. Well, let me tell you, and I've told this to people, I've said, what you're saying, that ain't true in East Texas. That's not been my experience. And I've worked for different school districts, and I've visited many different classrooms across this area. And that's just not been my experience at all. In fact, I remember one principal calling all the teachers to assemble in one classroom at a particular school to do what? To pray. He said, we're going to have prayer today. And then he did something which would shock a lot of you. You'd probably walk out and say, no, I'm not going to do that. He asked a female teacher to lead the prayer. So as I said, now if you tell me, well, I know of a school in some part of, New York or California that, okay, I'm not going to argue with you, but it's not a true statement across the board for all of public education. Another one that comes to mind is criticisms of doctors in conventional medicine. Now that, I know we have a history in the church with that, so I understand where some of that is coming from. But I also, and this is a little personal, I guess, I also have a daughter who is in med school. And she's about to finish in the spring. She will have finished. And she attends with, not every single week, but she attends with the Church of God congregation fairly regularly. And she has kind of sort of complained to me, and she said, I can't tell you, Dad, how many times I will run into someone who, when I tell them that, they go telling me how terrible medicine is, how useless doctors are, how doctors, they're trying to keep this information from you. They don't want you to know all this stuff. And what do doctors know anyway? Because they, the people challenging her or confronting her, they have studied with the best teacher, Dr. Google. And Dr. Google knows all about medicine and all about, and let me just share with you, the last couple of years have been very stressful for her because there have been a couple of different exams that she's had to take, different years that are, absolutely daunting. I mean, just telling me about them, has sort of put me in my place in terms of any exam I may have taken in my life. And so I know that people who study medicine do work hard to study in their field. Now, she would be the first to admit, we don't know everything. There's lots of stuff we don't know. Absolutely true. But on the other hand, we have spent some time studying. We do know some things. And so to encounter someone who just dismisses all of that out of hand, says, nah, is kind of discouraging, you know. And so obviously, if I have an opinion, whether it's about public education, maybe I never would want my child in a public school. That's fine. It's free. You want to educate them in a different way, that's great, and I would support that. And I would applaud you doing that. And if you never want to darken the door of a doctor's office because you just absolutely don't want to, great, I will support you with that too. You don't have to do that. On the other hand, do we have to disparage them? Do we have to disparage public education? Do we have to disparage doctors and conventional medicine? I guess that's where I'm coming from. You see, the world's default mode seems to be negativity. You know, and Mr. Avey alluded to watching cable TV, and it's true. A lot of cable TV is just focus on negativity. You know, criticize this, criticize that, criticize everything. And since we're still in the world, if we're not careful, our default mode can become negativity too. We can sort of absorb it by osmosis, if you will, without even realizing it, because we're surrounded by it. You know, sometimes I've given people the analogy of, why do you speak English, and why do you speak English the way you do? It's because you absorbed it growing up. Everybody around you spoke English. And if you have a particular accent, that's the accent that you absorbed. If you had grown up in China, you wouldn't be speaking English. Correct? So we absorb things without even thinking about them, without even reflecting on them. And then another question, is Christianity a religion of negativity? Is being a Christian, is that something that is considered negative, you know, to us? I'm not talking about what other people think. Or is it one of hope and positivity? Should Christians be downers, or should we feel uplifted and inspired when we talk with fellow believers? In Luke 18, this is a passage that I think we've often looked at, starting in verse 9, going on through verse 17 this time. Luke 18, Jesus told a parable to some who were confident that they were righteous and looked down on everyone else. And he says, Luke 18, starting verse 10, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself like this. So this particular translation uses about. So he's praying about himself. He's not really praying to God. He's kind of boasting about himself. And he says, God, I thank you. Let me just stop there for a minute. God, I thank you. Now, many of us presumably pray that prayer, and we go on to thank God for his blessings, and maybe we enumerate the blessings that we are thankful for. Okay, but look at what this man does. He says, God, I thank you. What does he say? I thank you that I am not like other people. I thank you that I'm a great guy. You know, you're lucky to have me. I'm not like other people, extortionists, unrighteous people, adulterers, all these people on that evil side of the continuum, or even like this tax collector who fits right in with them. I fast. I like them. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of everything I get. Aren't I great? Verse 13, the tax collector, however, stood far off and would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, sinner that I am. I tell you that this man went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. And the one who exalted himself, of course, had to be negative about everybody else, in being positive about himself falsely, but you know, his belief was wrong. But still, in praising himself, he also put down even this guy who's there with him. And some commentators say that in the parable, the Pharisee is praying out loud. Now, if that were the case, the tax collector would hear him, condemning him. So there is that danger. And he goes on to say, this continues with the little children. People were even bringing their babies, this is verse 15, for him to touch. But when the disciples saw it, they began to scold those who brought them. And again, you think, well, wait a minute. This negativity kicks in. The negativity of the guy who thought he was righteous, that he was better than everybody else. And here, the negativity of the people who think they know who should be allowed to come to Christ and who shouldn't. Who is a real Christian, who isn't? We decide that. Verse 16, but Jesus called for the children, saying, let the children come to me. Don't try to stop them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, whoever does not receive the kingdom like a child will never enter it. Because these children, as you know with little children, not that they're perfect. We're not suggesting, Jesus was not suggesting their behavior is perfect, but they are willing to accept instruction, direction. They're receptive to all of that. So Jesus had a lesson for people to learn. And it's a positive one versus the disciples' negative reaction. Jesus prayed in John 17, the prayer he prayed right before his betrayal, that his followers should not be of the world. Of the world. Because sometimes we have this going on in our minds, well, we're not of the world. Jesus prayed that we not be of the world. In the New Testament, there are 3 words that are used for the world, depending on your translation. And so you have cosmos in John 17. The word world is cosmos, which just means, worldly affairs, the way the world works. But lest you jump on this and say, well, God says, Jesus said we shouldn't be part of the world. In Acts 17, Paul's preaching to the Athenians. He says, God made this cosmos. God made this cosmos. So you have to be a little bit careful. How are we not of the world? What did Jesus mean exactly? In Revelation 18, it doesn't talk about the world there, but it talks about Babylon, the fall of Babylon. And the call is made to God's people to come out of her. Come out of her, my people. And Babylon represents, I guess, the economic system, the enmeshed systems of this world. So don't be so tied in with the systems of this world that you just can't escape. Now, I suggest that unless you are completely off the grid, you interact with the world to one degree or another. But I think the argument here is that your heart is not with this world. There are so many scriptures that talk about our being pilgrims, our being aliens, our being strangers in this world, kind of like Abraham was. He was called out. It wasn't his land. It was promised to him. We're looking for a promised land, but his heart was not attached to that land that he was not a citizen of. In fact, Paul in Philippians 3, same book, verse 20, says our citizenship is not this world, it's in heaven. So that's what we are attached to. That is where we are enmeshed, hopefully. And is that a positive world that we are involved with? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it was so good at the feast. I had the opportunity also to go out and fellowship, have a meal with people, old friends, people I've known for years, some people, new people I'd met. And, after one particular meal, I just remember coming out and thinking, these people, this is my community. These are my people. I feel so at home here. This is just fantastic. So, you realize, and that's not to say we can't have friendships elsewhere, but I think some of the dearest friendships that many of us have, maybe most of us have, are with people whose citizenship is in heaven. Another word for world is the one used in 2 Corinthians 4:4, the God of this world, as it says in King James. Some translations say the God of this age, because the Greek word is aion, the root of the word eon in English. So an age, a space of time. So this age as opposed to the age to come. So that's another word that's used. Well, are we of this age? Of course, we live in this age. So we are in this world because we're living in this time. And then the other word is a word that is much less used to mean world, and that is in Revelation. It's used in one place, in Revelation 12:9, talking about the serpent who deceives the whole world. And world there is oikumene, meaning the inhabited world, where people are, where people live. But we are in the world. I mean, what about your neighbors, the people you live near? Or what about your coworkers, the people you work with? They're the world too, I've had situations over the years, and what comes to mind is usually car trouble. And when I've had many people, strangers, help me out. People I didn't know, people who just saw me, they're driving by, they stop, they help. They've all been very kind. I've had that very positive experience. And I remember as a kid, I used to hitchhike to and from school when I missed the bus, which happened a lot because I'd be late. And again, every single time, many kind people. And that's not to say, please, that you should pick up hitchhikers or that you should hitchhike. I think perhaps there are some dangers there, and maybe I didn't know enough to not do it. But we've encountered people who are all of the world, who've helped us, who've been kind to us, who've been nice to us, who've been very decent people to us. And then think about, who did Jesus condemn during his ministry when he was on earth? Did he spend time condemning the Roman government? Tiberius Caesar was in power. Now, towards the end of Tiberius Caesar's time, he went off, kind of left Rome in charge of somebody else, and went off to Capri, and according to Tacitus, Roman historian, he lived a debauched life, immoral life on Capri, having a great time, but not caring about his people. Do we see even once any reference to that in Jesus' ministry? Does he go on and say, hey, he does say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but you don't find him criticizing Tiberius. He says nothing about him. Do you find him criticizing the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate? He talks to him, or even Herod himself. Doesn't go around, he describes him as a fox, astute, but he's not in there hammering away at Herod Antipas. What Jesus usually criticized and condemned was the religious leadership of his day. That's where he's at, for their double standard and hypocrisy, as well as others who made an outward show of being religious, as we just read it there in Luke 18. Another example, of course, that should come to mind is the vendors and money changers in the temple forecourts. Who would he be criticizing today? Let me just read in the example in John 2. John 2, starting verse 13. The Jewish feast of Passover was near, so Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple courts those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, animals needed for the sacrifices, and the money changers sitting at tables. And apparently money changers were needed because some coins had figures of gods or whatever, and those were not considered acceptable in the temple, so they had to change their money. And he overturned, I skipped that. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold the doves, he said, take these things away from here. Do not make my Father's house a marketplace. And elsewhere in other versions, you also see him when he's done it. He does it again later. A den of thieves, not just a marketplace, you've made it a den of thieves. And his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will devour me. But he is attacking religious malpractice. And I dare say today, if he were preaching, that's what he would be doing also, rather than focusing on, whoever the equivalent of Tiberius Caesar is today. And as I draw to a close, not quite done yet, but getting there, think about what first attracted you to the church of God. What did God use to call you? Back in my day, and forgive me, even more so in Ron Avey's day, it was Basil Wolverton's illustrations in the booklet 1975 in Prophecy. Now, for some that means a whole lot. For some of you, it's, don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, there was a booklet that had illustrations about all the horrible things that were going to happen to humanity before Jesus returned. And Basil Wolverton, who also illustrated for Mad Magazine, could do horrible boils on people's faces and whatever like nobody else. Maybe his son, Monty, still a cartoonist, maybe his son does some good work too. Now, I personally never actually got to see that booklet. I heard a lot about it, but I think by the time I started attending, since some of the things there weren't going to work out quite that way, I don't know if they got rid of the booklet or whatever. It might be worth something on eBay. I don't know. If you have that, you might be able to sell it. But a number of people told me that that's what drew them in. Because, why? They wanted to be spared all the pain and anguish and suffering of the day of the Lord and the great tribulation. And they wanted to be sure to be taken to a place of safety for protection. And so it was motivated, at least in part, by fear. Now, fear, like pain, has its place. It can help us choose to do the right thing. But love is not made perfect in fear. We don't stay there. In 1 John 4:18, for example, we read, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear," because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears punishment has not been perfected in love. So someone who thinks of God as a punishing God, as a harsh God, perhaps still has that negative view of God. And then is not perfected in love. But perfect love casts out fear. Now, in my own case, and this had nothing to do with me, this is no credit to me whatsoever, just happened to be the booklet that caught my attention was titled "The Wonderful World Tomorrow, What It Will Be Like." Some of you may remember that too, "The Wonderful World Tomorrow, What It Will Be Like." And it painted a picture of the world tomorrow that showed a world finally at peace. And perhaps it had to do with the fact that, in my family there was conflict, but I saw there's finally going to be peace and harmony and people living productive lives without fear, but harmony and joy and positivity, not negativity. And of course, the scripture that comes to mind with this is Romans 14:17, and you may have had that read during the feast. You may have read it yourself. Romans 14:17, Paul writes, "The kingdom of God does not consist of food and drink, but righteousness, peace, and joy." The kingdom of God reflects righteousness, peace, and joy. And there's no negativity in that picture whatsoever. It's kind of like every man dwelling under his, vine and fig tree. Even when that happened during Solomon's reign, by the way, it wasn't totally perfect because there was a huge tax burden. If you recall, when Rehoboam succeeded Solomon, he told the people, "You think the tax burden under my dad was bad? I'm going to make it way worse." And of course, then most of the tribes left it because of that. And you don't blame them. But this picture of the kingdom of God is one that should fill us with righteousness, peace, and joy. It's a positive picture, not a negative one. Okay, to conclude, I'm going to go back to Philippians 4. That's what we started. But I'd like to read the section from verse 1 through verse 9. Philippians 4, verses 1 through 9. So starting in verse 1, "So then, my brothers and sisters, dear friends whom I long to see, my joy and crown, stand in the Lord in this way, my dear friends. And as I've said before, this book is a letter full of positivity of a man who is in prison and suffering there, because I'm sure that prisons in that day were not any kind of fun. And he starts off in verse 2 saying, I appeal to Euodia and to Syntyche to agree in the Lord. And most commentators will tell you that these appear to be two ladies in the church who had some sort of conflict, some sort of disagreement. We don't know if it was major or minor, but presumably it was serious enough. The word had reached Paul, and he says to them, come on, guys, agree. Even if you have to agree to disagree, just get together in the Lord. This is harmony. This is positive, not negative. Don't fight. Don't feud. Yes, I say also to you, true companion, help them. They've struggled together in the gospel ministry along with me and Clement and my other co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. And look at that statement, whose names are in the book of life. He doesn't say, I don't know. I don't know about Clement. Sometimes he's acting, I don't know if he'll be in the book of life, but maybe. No, he says confidently, whose names are in the book of life. That's a positive message. He's not questioning that. And then he goes on in verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. This is, I'm reminding you again, a man who is in prison. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice. If you didn't get it the first time, I'm going to say it again. Let everyone see your gentleness. The Lord is near. He also looked forward to the coming of the Lord. And do not be anxious about anything. Do not be anxious about anything. Could we say that describes us? Are you anxious about anything? Am I anxious about anything? Well, Paul goes on to say, instead, in every situation, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, tell your requests to God. So if you do have anything that you're anxious about, give your request to God. Leave it in his hand, and you know that he will take care of it. And he will give you his peace. Verse 7, the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And such peace is positive, and that will be reflected as we were reading at the very beginning. What is in our hearts will come out of our mouths. And that's what we'll say, and that's what we'll think, and that's how we'll act. Finally, brothers and sisters, verse 8, what we read at the beginning, whatever is true, whatever is worthy of respect, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if something is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things. And if you do that, how can you fail to be positive? You can't. That positivity will just emanate from every pore of your being. And what you learned and received and heard and saw in me, do these things, and the God of peace will be with you. The God of peace and positivity. The God of peace will be with you.